would keep the commander-in-chief going. But it didn't stop the war from escalating on all fronts. In 1942, the big picture was the possibility of a Russian capitulation. Stalin insisted that only the opening of a second front in northern France would save Russia from impending defeat. Also pressing the strategy were General George Marshall and many of the American chiefs. But Churchill strongly objected. He feared the casualties would be horrendous. For weeks, the Anglo-American allies spent their energies fighting each other.
There were knockdown, drag-out, bitter fights. Marshall once said, you know, I spend all my days trying to sort out disputes between the Air Force and the Army and the Navy and between the British and the French and the Americans, and it's only at the end of the day when I get home and fix my first highball that I remember that I'm fighting the Germans and the Japanese.
The coalition was in crisis before it had undertaken its first joint operation. Churchill would have to take another trip across the Atlantic to prevent a breach with Roosevelt. On June 19, 1942, the British Prime Minister flew to Hyde Park to bridge the divide separating the two Allied nations. In the library of the Roosevelt family home, FDR and Churchill agreed to push ahead with the development of the Manhattan Project, the joint effort to build an atomic bomb. That agreement had been simple to achieve. But as the leaders sat around the pool at Eleanor's home at Valkill, Churchill tried to convince Roosevelt to commit U.S. troops to a North African landing. It wouldn't require taking on German forces directly. Instead, Churchill was promising an easier fight against the Vichy French.
But Churchill not only prevails upon Roosevelt to do this, but he manages, in one of the great act of political wizardry, to convince Roosevelt that the North African operation was Roosevelt's original idea, which was just nuts because it was really Churchill's operation. The American military chiefs of staff dismissed this as periphery pecking. Their objective was to knock out Germany's capacity to wage war by knocking out its industrial establishment. So North Africa, from this strategic perspective, was a great distraction.
To lead American forces into North Africa, FDR passed over 366 more senior officers to appoint General Dwight Eisenhower. Roosevelt told his family why.
He has the best political mind of all the generals I have. Eisenhower hid it. Behind that warm smile and the joking manner and so forth was a steely mind.
What FDR didn't know was that Eisenhower was one of the generals fiercely opposed to the operation he was now to lead. But regardless of his apprehension, Operation Torch, the North African invasion, began on November 8, 1942. General George Patton, aboard the USS Augusta, oversaw the landing of more than 33,000 Allied forces. Roosevelt was in Hyde Park when he received news by telephone that the assault had begun. An aide noticed that his hand was trembling. He listened, then announced, "We have landed in North Africa. Casualties are below expectations. We are fighting back." He reassured the country that acting as the United Nations, the Allied powers had just begun their counterattack.
I cannot tell you when or where the United Nations are going to strike next in Europe, but we are going to strike and strike hard.
In January 1943, FDR and Churchill arrived in newly liberated Morocco for a top-secret conference at Casablanca. Stalin was invited, but insisted it was too dangerous to leave Moscow. Roosevelt decided to travel without Secretary of State Cordell Hull. He told his staff that Hull was stubborn, inflexible, and difficult to handle. He would have been such a nuisance, Roosevelt told Averell Harriman, one of the few advisors brought along. He relied instead on Harry Hopkins and Generals Marshall and Eisenhower. It was on the final day of the conference that FDR made real news. Without consulting Churchill, he announced uncompromising terms for ending the war against Hitler.
So then Roosevelt said, I feel that victory against Germany, true victory against Germany, can only be achieved by unconditional surrender. And he looked at Churchill as if, of course, we agreed on this and so forth. And Churchill was absolutely flabbergasted. And moreover, standing behind Roosevelt was George Marshall, Dwight Eisenhower, and a whole slew of other American generals, all of whom loathed the idea, because it was only going to make the Germans fight harder.
But the purpose of Roosevelt's announcement was to stiffen Russian resolve, prove to Stalin that he should hang on, that America was serious about defeating Germany and intended to fight to the bitter end. At the end of the conference, Churchill suggested that the president forget the burdens of war and travel with the prime minister across the Moroccan desert to a magical spot Churchill wanted to share. Thousands of American troops lined the route from Casablanca to Marrakesh. At La Sadia, a villa overlooking the Atlas Mountains, Roosevelt was lifted up 62 steps to the top of a tower to watch the sunset.
There's a wonderful picture of the two men at this moment, where Churchill is staring at Roosevelt with a kind of tenderness in his eyes. And I really think that begins to show the deep affection of the two men.
The Casablanca Conference was the high point of Churchill's war, the last time he and Roosevelt would meet as equals. For Roosevelt, the conference and the two-day diversion left an indelible impression.
My grandfather talked at the dinner table about not only that beautiful sunset, but the pleasure that Winston Churchill had. And the reason I talk about their friendship is that you could sense from FDR's comments, the tone of his voice, the warmth in his voice, that he appreciated Churchill's appreciation of the scene. I can assure you that FDR would not have been carried up the 62 steps to get up into the tower unless it was because his friend wanted it.
But sadly, there was someone missing that first night home after a journey of 8,000 miles, an absence that, for FDR, compounded a growing sense of isolation.
When Franklin returned from Casablanca, one gets the feeling that he couldn't wait to tell Eleanor all about what had happened there with Churchill, and so many stories to tell. And just as when he was a young boy, when he'd come home from college or home from school, his mother would be there with welcoming arms, he goes into the White House hoping that she will be there with welcoming arms. But sadly, when he gets there, there's a handwritten note from Eleanor saying, "Welcome home. Sorry I can't be here, but I had a pre-arranged lecture at Cooper Union." It seemed that always there were two ships passing in the night.
Few outside the Roosevelt family knew that the war was significantly draining the president's strength and resilience, that the job he once said he loved was exacting a cruel toll.
By the summer of 1943, Roosevelt was pretty lonely. Missy LeHand had had her stroke, his mother had died, and I think he needed Eleanor. He needed her almost as if he wanted her to be his wife again.
It had been 25 years since Franklin's infidelity with Lucy Mercer nearly destroyed the Roosevelts' marriage. Now he wanted to try to restore his relationship with his wife. During a tour of Southern and Midwestern Army bases, Franklin asked Eleanor whether she would be willing to stay home more, keep him company, and become his emotional as well as political partner. Eleanor asked for time to consider.
When they finally got back to the conversation about whether or not she might re-establish her relationship with him, what she did with great enthusiasm was to say, "Could I please have permission to go and visit the troops in the South Pacific?"
FDR didn't argue. He would never again broach the idea that the rift that had grown between them might be healed. Instead, he approved Eleanor's request, one that would take her on a 23,000-mile trip through the Pacific and would shake Eleanor to her core. In the summer of 1943, Eleanor set off for the Pacific. She was to visit nearly 400,000 soldiers. The men loved her.
I walked through miles of hospital wards on that trip. So many times the serviceman's face would light up if I could say, "I know your town."
For the first time, Eleanor confronted the reality of war, images of death and dying that left an indelible mark.
She was seeing the other face of war when she went to the South Pacific, so contrasting to that excited face of war that you saw